what seems like the 100th time, I flip through the pages of Wuthering Heights until I get to the word list at the back of the book. I scan the notes and definitions column, as we are supposed to refer to it when we come across a word we don't know. I stare at the section, reading words like grammalicon, penetralium, and elysium, and I question if the book is even written in English at all. I rest my now aching head on my desk, wondering if Emily Bronte's extravagant vocabulary is actually going to be useful in my future. The world is constantly changing. Technology is evolving, education is improving, and the human mind is changing too. Yet, in my high school English class, students are reading books written as far back as the 19th century. In this episode, I'm keeping an open mind about this subject. I aim to learn the reasons for reading classical novels and what this generation should be taking away from older literature. In Downers Grove with the Blueprint News Network, I'm your host, Ellie Scannell. I decided to first turn to a lover of classical novels and one of my favorite teachers, Marcus Andreyka. Thankfully for me, he makes books like Wuthering Heights much easier to understand. But I still wonder, why are students reading the classics after all these years?
I think the reason that they're in the curriculum isn't just because we like them. It's because they're really good books to teach, because they're great books for a reason, because they have a certain amount of complexity in them that a lot of popular fiction doesn't have.
It makes sense that contemporary fiction may be easier to read, but it doesn't carry the history and kind of message that older literature does. Maybe looking up words and stopping to think while reading Wuthering Heights is actually helping me as a reader.
Today's great literature can become tomorrow's classic. I think literature does evolve, and I think that that's one of the reasons why you shouldn't just read contemporary literature, because if you don't read a book like Wuthering Heights, for example, you never really have an understanding of where the current literature comes from. So yeah, literature evolves and changes. Sometimes there are great books that fall by the wayside. The Great Gatsby, for example, went out of print. You couldn't even buy it. It just got picked up by some English teachers, and people started studying it, and they realized it was important, and it got resurrected. So sometimes a classic book can be lost too, just like anything, because people don't recognize it as being a great book at the time.
With my teacher's insight, I wanted to hear from someone with another perspective. My mom, Lori Scannell, is a great writer and has sat through many English classes reading old literature. Because my mom had been in my place years ago, I was curious about what she thought about the classics.
I do think reading classic literature has made me a better writer. I think first is just like learning good, solid structure and technique. This is the reason these novels are so well respected and why they've stayed around, because the writing itself is just really exceptional.
Classic books are classic for a reason. They've been respected throughout history for having structure, thorough detail, and creativity. These qualities stand out reading any great book. We can still look back on this respected way of writing today, as well as learn from it.
Also, I think a lot of novels now try to avoid having like a moral to the story. Maybe authors are worried about coming across as being preachy or annoying, or it's not going to be politically correct or popular. Whereas before it was more common and I think expected that it would have a message. But what was good in many of the classic novels is that they were so great at like weaving that story that had the message at its core, but it was told in a way that let the reader kind of figure it out for themselves.
And with that, my initial question was answered. Classic novels are the foundation English literature was built off of. They are time capsules that have inspired people for generations and paved the way for modern literature. By learning and reading what society has evolved from, we can better understand how the world we live in came to be. As I flip through the pages of Wuthering Heights with this idea in mind, I realized that these types of books have importance too. A tree doesn't grow without roots, just as literature doesn't develop if we forget where it began. Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode. Until next time, in Downers Grove with the Blueprint News Network, I'm Ellie Scannell.